Alright, hopefully at this point we have a good understanding of what colonization is, and what it means to be a colonial power, and we also have a good understanding of France, Great Britain, and Germany, and how their history was impacted by colonization and becoming colonial powers, and how they impacted the history of other people with their colonial prowess. So now what I want to do is I want you to just, if you have like paper and work on your desk, like just make it go away, because I want your mind, I want your 2 ears, your 2 eyes, and most importantly your mouth, because I want to participate in a conversation. If you feel like you don't have a lot of top of the head knowledge on colonization, and if you feel like maybe this stuff was really boring to you and you're not going to remember enough to participate in a conversation, grab a laptop, pull up Internet Explorer, or hopefully Mozilla is on there by now, and get them fingers ready for some Google, so you can investigate yourself and participate in this conversation. I want to focus on some historical themes, and I'm going to ask you to pause this video at 4 points, and I'll let you know. I'll point at the camera and I'll say pause when I actually want you to pause it, okay? Because I'll probably tell you you're going to pause it, and that's not right when I want you to pause it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to outline some themes that I want you to consider. When I outline these themes, I want you to consider how the history we just learned about may have impacted different people at different places in different times throughout history. And before I do that thing I told you that I was going to do, I'm going to give you an example of something that I thought of how, Germany's colonization or Britain's colonization ended up having a butterfly effect, long-lasting ramifications that can be tied together and kind of carry over one to the next. So, I want you to think about the culture of the local people and the indigenous people. And again, indigenous are the people that kind of are the original explorers, the people that arrived there by foot, settled in, and created their own civilization. So an example of indigenous in America would be Native Americans, are the indigenous people of North America. So the indigenous people of Africa, we as Westerners and people that are fairly ignorant of local ethnic groups and stuff like that, we would typically just call them African. We do the same thing with Europe, where we look at Europe and we call it European. So I'm going to ask you to look at it from a macro perspective, but I also want you to start considering how small local communities may have been affected, specifically groups. And I'll give you an example from those in a little bit. So, sorry, I digress. An example of how the culture of Africa as a whole was affected is there are many places in Africa where the primary language, the first language spoken today, is French or British, English. So there's parts of Africa where you could go and you could go have a fluent conversation with an African individual in English. So, ready? I want you to consider this question, and I want us to have a conversation about some of the ideas and things you come up with. Pause. Now, I forgot to tell you to restart the videos eventually, so I'm hoping you restarted. After every pause, I want you to just kind of facilitate the conversation for maybe 5 minutes. Present what you think. Again, I'm not that concerned about being right or wrong. Being right is a little overrated. You learn a lot more from being wrong. Just want you to think, and I want you to learn from each other, and I want you to lead the instruction. Alright, so for the next theme I want us to think about global connection. Alright? An example that I thought of for global connection is how now we are living in the age of what many call globalization. So what we essentially learned is that keeping colonies is fairly expensive, and it is a lot better to simply willingly trade with one another and build each other up. And, you have this, I have this. I'm really good at making corn. You're really good at pumping oil. I'll trade you this much of my corn for this much of your oil. And it's good for both sides. So we call that globalization. We also are seeing less war, and we are also seeing a higher standard of living in places that were before colonized, such as South Africa, than we are seeing in the few African countries that were not colonized. So that's something interesting we need to consider. So I want you to think of the global connection. Ready? Pause. Okay. The next one we're going to talk about is called people, place, and environment. So what do I mean by that? Again, I want you to imagine, even though you might not know the name of many of the indigenous groups and indigenous peoples throughout Africa, I don't expect you to, but an example of one would be the Zulus. That's a very popularly known group. Imagine how they were affected. Imagine how their lives were changed by colonial practices. An example of this is that before World War I, and I'm talking years and years before World War I, the global powers were fairly certain there was going to be a world war. And they knew this because they were all scrambling to get colonies, because the colonies had all the resources. So one of the things that was fairly common was for an indigenous village to essentially get plowed over and displaced, so that the colonial powers such as Britain, France, and Germany could plant rubber trees, because rubber is a very important resource to have during a time of war. So think about some other examples of how people, places, and environments could have been impacted by colonization. Pause. Okay. Lastly, I want you to consider the individual development and identity of indigenous peoples of Africa and how it may have been impacted by colonization. Now, the best and kind of worst example of this I could think of was the Tutsi and the Hutu in Rwanda. Now, eventually, Rwanda is in the hands of, I believe it is Belgium. Now, I know Germany had pieces of Rwanda as well. So I don't know if this is a deal that occurred after World War I. I think it did. I am not positive. I believe it was in 1935 when they were trying to distinguish between the different groups in this region that we go on now to call Rwanda. And the two primary ethnicities were the Tutsi and the Hutu. Now, they had already kind of established a hierarchy amongst each other. The Tutsi were typically taller and light-skinned and typically owned cattle. That was kind of a sign of prestige and success among their culture. The Hutu were typically a little shorter, darker-skinned, and would work in the fields. So the Belgium took note of this, and what they did is they handed out ID cards. Tutsi, Hutu, Tutsi, Hutu. And although they had already come up with this distinction on their own, they at least had a decent working relationship. It was fairly symbiotic. The Tutsi would often bring their cattle to graze in the water of the Hutu, because the Hutu needed more access to water for their crops. And again, there was a reciprocal nature to the relationship. But when the Belgium came in, and the Danish, the Belgium, we'll look it up. When they came in and started to hand out ID cards, now this distinction, this ethnic distinction between the two groups became not only more visible, but it started to become a point of contention. because the leadership in Belgium decided they were going to rely on the Hutu, I'm sorry, not the Hutu, the Tutsi, to be the ones that were primarily in control. So what ends up happening? Well, if you ever seen the movie Hotel Rwanda in 1993, you have what's called the Rwandan genocide, where somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people are hacked to death with machetes because of the, what I think they would call racial, but what we would call ethnic tension between groups. So now, I want you to consider, and by the way, this is the last time you're going to have to restart. I'm going to give you a pause, and you can shut it off if you want to. I want you to consider the individual development and identity of the indigenous African people and how they may or may not have been affected by colonization. Ready? Pause.